Hello, hello. Welcome back to another Python tutorial. Well, I guess this one's not really like Python specifically, but it's in the broader scope of getting started with Python. Yes, so we are on our series where we are talking about how to get up and running and started with Pythons on the Windows operating system. All right, in our last video, we did a couple things. We installed Visual Studio Code, which is going to be our code editor. This is going to be the place where we write, debug, and all sorts of different things with our code. And then we also installed Git, which is a source control manager. And basically the whole idea behind a source control manager is it allows us to track changes in our files and basically save those changes. And then at different points, if I want to revert back to an earlier copy of my code, I can easily do that by just typing in a few commands in the terminal, and then lo and behold, I am at an earlier version. Now, Git is actually a pretty big topic, and there's a lot of different components to it, and some are more important than other ones. And part of when we're working on GitHub, it's gonna be good to have an idea of just some core concepts before we actually start doing the commands. Now, at this point, if I go over it and you're kind of like, I'm really not getting it, don't freak out a little bit. A lot of this is kind of just going to make more sense as we do it, but ideally having certain terminology and understanding what that term means will be a little bit more useful when you're going in and actually doing those kind of activities. So we're going to spend a couple minutes talking about some concepts that are important for Git. And then once we do that, we're going to go and sign into GitHub, and we'll talk about how to create a GitHub account. And then once we sign into GitHub, we're going to get familiar with the layout. We'll talk kind of the important locations, the semi-important locations, and then we're going to create our first repository. So that repository is where we're going to be writing the code for our project. Once we've created that repository, we are then going to clone it to our local system using VS Code. So a lot's going to be covered in this video. It's pretty important. I would say definitely exploring GitHub is where I would spend most of the time in this video, only because you really want to make sure you understand how to use GitHub and kind of the features that are there. So with that being said, let's get started. Let me readjust for a second. All right. Git concepts. There's a lot of concepts when it comes to working with Git, but some are more important than other ones. The first important concept I want to talk about is this idea of a distributed system. Now, Git is a distributed system. And what that means is that you can basically, we're making it where each individual can have their own copy of a repository. So no one person is the master source of that particular copy. A lot of times, we are cloning or we're taking a copy from a centralized location, but there's nothing stopping us from making our own local copy unique. So we don't have to follow necessarily what is on what we'll call the central location. So really just the important part here is that with a distributed system, each person who clones a repository has their own repository. So that way, even when we're not connected to the internet, say we lose internet connection, we don't lose our code. We have our own copy of our code because we are cloning it to our own local system. That's the distribution aspect. I'm taking it from a central location and I am distributing it to other locations. So it's not centralized. And then once I have my own local copy, technically speaking, I could then distribute it to other people if I wanted to. There's nothing stopping me from sending my own copy to somebody else. Now, if this concept is a little bit confusing, I did bring up a little bit of a web page just to kind of give more of a visual. So if you actually go to git.com, it's really nice. They actually give you some background on this, and they talk about version control, and they try to give you a comparison. And they start out by talking about a local version control system. And basically here with a local one, we have a single file, and then we have versions of that file. And that's all on our local computer. The next one would be a centralized version control system. And basically, we're now going to incorporate this more centralized server where each person is kind of getting that more centralized one. So we all are pulling from the same location. So in other words, computer B cannot copy from computer A. We're all pulling from our main source. And then we have a distributed version control system. So in this situation, it looks very similar to a centralized version control system, but the unique thing here is we're not all stuck pulling from this server. We can transfer between other computers. So that's the distribution aspect, is it doesn't matter which direction I go, I can always pull from somebody. Where we're centralized, we're all pulling from the same location. In local, there really is no sharing. It's just all local to your system. So important. It's good to know it. I'm not going to say you're going to necessarily revisit it a ton, but it's a good idea to understand because I think it will start driving home certain concepts. Now, I talked a little bit about copying, right? And so copying can mean different things depending on kind of where you are and how you do it. Now, on GitHub, copying is a little bit different because you're going to see that we're going to be using git clone, but on GitHub, there's also this option with forking. And forking is kind of like copying, but basically what we're doing is we're taking another repository that's on GitHub and we're copying it and we're putting it under our own username. And what that basically means is we've just taken someone else's repository and they said, hey, we like their project. I think I could make that useful in my own project. So we make a copy of it and we put it under our own username. And that is the concept of forking. Now, there's this other thing called cloning, and this is where people kind of get confused because they're going to say, well, forking and cloning sound very similar, but it's kind of where they're going that distinguishes their difference. At least that's kind of how I like to do it. Think about it. Because on forking, it stays within GitHub. But when we talk about cloning, we can take a copy of our repo that is on GitHub and we can clone it to our local system. So forking, it stays on GitHub. Cloning, we can take it off GitHub and we can put it on our local system. That's the kind of the key difference when I think about forking versus cloning. Very similar, but it's about where it's going. With forking, it's still kind of on that central location, where with cloning, we can actually take it off our GitHub repository and we can make a local copy of our code on our own local system. So we're going to be using cloning a lot, but we'll also find that forking comes in handy when you want to make contributions to a particular repository. Now, I have lots of repositories on GitHub. People contribute to them. They fork it. They make their own copies, and they contribute what they think is valuable for a library. And so forking is really important because when you want to contribute to code on GitHub, normally you're going to start by forking that repository or copying it, making your own changes, and then doing something called a pull request. Okay, next topic. So branches. Where is this idea of branching come into play? Well, remember how we said GitHub is really good about tracking changes in your files, in your code files. Well, when we talk about branching, it's basically like we're taking a snapshot of our particular repository at some point in time. And what we do is we basically make a copy of it, but we define it as a branch. And really, the whole idea of branching is that you can take your code that you know is working, you can branch off of it and take that working version, start modifying that working version, but not actually touch the source. So you're not touching the source, you're taking your own branch and you're modifying that branch. And then that what it makes it is it's independent from each other. So even though they're of the same code, they're kind of their own separate copies. And when on that branch, you can make your changes. Usually you have things like you might add a feature, right? So imagine you had a web application as a repository, and now you want to add a new feature, like maybe you want to be able to download certain data. You would create a new branch because you have your working website. You're going to create a new branch. You're going to incorporate that new feature. And then once you get it all working and tested and validated, you then do this concept called merging. And that basically means that you're going to take that change and you're going to push it into your master branch. Now, branches are a core concept. I'll just read the definition in Git. Unlike centralized version control, branches in Git don't show up as folders in the file system. Instead, your project folder only contains the contents of one branch, which you check out. So when I want to create a new branch or I want to go into a new branch, I'm going to check out a branch. And so what we do is when we say we're checking out, we're basically going to a new branch of our repository. You can have multiple branches on a repository. And you can actually have some branches that are on your local system that you might not actually have on your master one. So lots of confusion here. And I feel like this is kind of where people get a little bit confused with Git, because you'll find like, well, I have this branch on my GitHub repo, but I don't see it on my local repo. Well, this is where we have to get in. We have to pull those changes. And so we'll talk again about that. But again, branches are basically just kind of branching off your main code. And that's usually when we want to add a new feature or maybe even fix a bug, for example. So now we're going to get into certain commands that we're going to be using when we are working with Git. A very popular command is called fetch. We use fetch to fetch the changes on the remote repository. That's a key word there, right? Remote. What does remote mean? Remote is usually referring to the remote repository, or the repository that is on GitHub. It's remote from us. It's not next to me. It's in a remote area, a remote part of town. So with remote, we're usually talking about our repository on GitHub. We use fetch to fetch the changes that might be on the remote repository that are not, keyword not, on my system. So we use fetch to grab those changes and bring them down to our repository. We use merge to merge those new changes to our local repo. Fetch, I grab, merge, I bend, and I put it into it, right? Now, somebody was smart and said, wait a minute, 2 commands, can't we just do it in one? You can do it in one. You can use what is called a pull request. A pull request fetches and merges the changes all in one command. Now, sometimes what might happen is you're going to fetch some changes, but you're going to have your own changes on your repository. And then something's going to happen. We're going to have something called a merge conflict, because it just so happens that your change has modified the section of the code that was also changed on the repository. So what do? Well, at that point, we have a merge conflict, and we have to resolve that conflict. You have to tell me, which change do I keep? Do I keep the ones that are being pulled in? Or do I keep the ones that are on my local repository? And so different ways of doing it. Basically in VS Code, you just kind of scroll through your code and you say, okay, well, keep this one, disregard that one. A lot of times it's usually pretty minimal, but depending on how much your code has been modified, it can get pretty substantial. And so merge conflicts do happen. There's nothing wrong with it or anything like that. But when they do pop up, you do have to decide, which are you keeping? Are you going to keep your local changes? Or are you going to pull in the changes that are coming in? So the incoming changes, the changes that are coming from our remote repository. Okay, so that is pulling in changes. What if we want to send changes from our local repository into our remote repository? Well, now we're going to talk about staging, committing, and pushing our changes. When we say stage, which is a command, we are adding the files that we are preparing to commit, or in other words, we are preparing to save. So staging is saying, I'm going to grab these files because I want to take a snapshot of them because I'm going to commit those changes. So when we stage, we add the files we want to bind to a commit. When we commit, we save those changes made to those files. Once we've saved those changes, we then push those changes to our remote repository on GitHub. So again, stage, commit, and push. Fetch, merge, and pull. Important concepts. I think that's the last slide. So with that being said, let's jump in to GitHub. We'll talk about creating an account. It's super simple. And then we will log into our account. So I'm gonna go on my virtual machine. I hope everybody's having a wonderful Saturday. I'm sure many people will not be watching this on Saturday, but that's okay. No, you don't have to bring it back up. Okay, so I'm gonna log into GitHub. Okay. So if you type in GitHub, you're gonna see a couple options. You're probably seeing that at the top. You want this one right down here. GitHub, where the world builds software. I think I'm already signed in, so I'll kind of just show you what it looks like when you're not signed in. Okay, so when you go to GitHub for your first time, this is gonna be your page. If you do not have an account, you need to sign up for an account. Super, super simple. You're going to go over here into the right-hand corner, and you're going to notice an option for sign up. Click sign up. You'll be redirected to a new page. You need to provide a username. Make sure you write that down because you are going to be using that an awful lot. You're going to have an email address, and then you're going to have a password. Once you do all of that, you should be good to go, and then you can log in. I'm going to log in. If you land at this page, you already have it. You would just go to sign in. And then if you're like me, you probably have two-factor on. So when that happens, you're going to get sent a code. Well, you don't get sent a code. You have to look up your code. I have two-factor on for everything now, so life is not necessarily the most fun. Okay, perfect. And so when you log on, this is where you're going to be taken. This is the main GitHub page. You can access your repository. You can access issues. You can access your account settings. You can access a lot from this page. You can also access a lot of the same information here from different pages. On the left-hand side, you'll notice a list of repositories. This is, I think, the most recent ones you've worked on. I don't know how it's organized, but it's not going to show all of them because I have like 60, and you can see here, some are private, some are public, all sorts of fun stuff. Lots of good stuff. This is all the activity when it comes to, how people are interacting with your repo, if there's been changes and all sorts of different stuff. And so you'll see things like, hey, I have an issue with my code. You might see here people who follow your repositories, you would see that as well. And then they also have some exploratory ones as well. So if you want to, these are just some kind of automatic ones where you can, see some interesting stuff. It's interesting to see. If a little bell icon, this is where you get notifications. If you go over here where you can see your little profile setting, you can access your profile. You can actually access your repositories. There's this new thing called code spaces. So basically what they're trying to do is incorporate VS Code directly into GitHub. It's in the beta phase, so it's not officially released yet. I tried getting on beta. I haven't gotten on yet. I'm waiting patiently. But basically the idea behind it is you would be able to do all your coding directly from GitHub. Interesting concept. I'm curious to see how they implement it. I have no opinion about it yet. Projects, these are kind of more complex coding projects, so ones that might span multiple repos or all sorts of kind of different stuff. Discussion, so this is where if you do have discussions, again, this is a beta feature that they are rolling out on repositories. So I actually have it enabled on a few of my repositories, but this is basically like community things, right? So people can go on there. I can say, hey guys, I'm going to change one of my repositories. What do you all think? And then people can contribute and give some insight. Your stars, so these are the repositories that you follow. Your gist, this is basically like little snippets of code. That's the way I like to think of it. If you have people who sponsor your GitHub, then you would see them as well. So I do have a few sponsors, so I can see it. You can upgrade it, so you have enterprise accounts, all that kind of fun stuff. Featured preview, so you can actually turn on certain features before they come out. So I have a lot of these on. I'm one of those people who, when a feature comes out, I turn it on just to see what it's like. For better or for worse. Settings, sometimes you'll have to go there to do things like set up an API key if you plan to use the GitHub API, and even doing OAuth authentication. And then you can also sign out as well. So that's pretty cool. Let's go to my repositories, because a lot of times, like, I have this page saved. So when I normally see it, this is what I see. But when you jump to your repositories, you can actually see a full list of them. You can have private and public repositories. So I get this a lot, especially when I work with people on certain projects. They go, hey, Alex, I want to make sure nobody can see my code. And the first thing I tell them is, like, that's no problem. You just have to create a private repository on GitHub. And all that means is that you're the only one who can access it. Other people can access it, but guess what? You have to invite them. If you don't invite them, they can't see it. I can't access it. Nobody can access it. But you can see a full list of your repositories. I have a bunch of repositories. Some are public, some are private, all sorts of different stuff. You can also see the repository by type. You can see it by specific coding languages. And you can also sort your repositories. You can also create a new repository as well. Additionally, I do have dark theme turned on. You'll notice this little moon icon. I can look at this. Oh, so they changed it now. So now you have to go actually into appearances. Okay, well, I guess they changed it. Disregard that. It used to be you could just change it from right there. So yeah, this is my repositories. If I go to my overview page, I can actually see some of my popular repositories. So these are ones that I pin, and if someone goes to my profile, they will see, okay, I don't know why I did that. You can see my popular repositories. You can only have 6 repositories up here at a single time. So my most popular repository is my Sigma coding YouTube. So this was the first repository I made. And this is basically where I put a bunch of different code snippets and things like that. Now, I will say at this point, if you do not follow me on GitHub, I would probably recommend it only because a lot of times the code I am showing in my video, I am posting it on GitHub. So if you want access to the code, don't email me, go to my GitHub because you're going to find it there. And I'm just going to point you back to my GitHub profile if you do ask. So yeah, if you want access to the code that you see in my videos, make sure to follow me on GitHub because that is where I put all my code. You can also see contributions. So you can actually see where you are committing. So recently it's been my Power BI one and my new TD Ameritrade one. So I'm doing sorts of different stuff with that. All right. What else? So yeah, that's overview, that's repositories. You have projects. So this is again, kind of like more advanced, more specific. I would say like this is more like enterprise stuff, but I'm just throwing that out there. Packages, so you can actually package your repositories as well. This is not necessary. Like, so there's not like a package for Python, but you can post your package or you can automate the uploading of your package using GitHub. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. All right, so that's that page. So what we'll do is we're going to create a new repository from here. So how do you create a new repository? Well, there's a couple different places you can go. You can go to your repositories page and you can click new. You can go to this little plus icon and you can actually do a new repository. Now, some people might be given a repository and they want to import that repository directly into GitHub. Well, you can do that as well. You would just do an import repository. However, in our situation, we're going to create a new repository from GitHub. So I'm going to click new repository. You're going to be taken to a new page. Now, depending on how advanced you are, you can actually take a repository and save it as a template. Now, I do this only because I follow a pretty consistent pattern across a lot of my repositories. I follow a very specific, folder structure pattern. And so really the benefit of using a template is you get a bunch of starting files and folder structures ready to go. So that way you don't have to spend all your time setting it up. It's really helpful. And if you do want to kind of just see what it looks like, I can show it to you. It's not going to make a ton of sense, but you can see it. So I have one called Sigma template. This is a public one. So if you do like it, you can always copy it. There's no one stopping you. I mean, you can see right here, people have forked it. But basically, I just put in here like GitHub actions. So these are things to like automate certain procedures on GitHub. I just have certain folder structures. I have a README that's already like highly formatted to structures I already follow. Just different things on here that I've found useful. In our situation, I'm not going to use a template. I want us to write it from scratch. That way you guys have your own templates, or that way you understand kind of the code and the files and how we're modifying those files. It's easy to use a template, I get it, but especially when you're new to it, it's good that you write some of these files from scratch. So the first thing you're going to notice is the owner of your repository. It should be your username. So in this case, mine is areed1192. And then I need to give my repository a name. Now, keep in mind, if you're making a public repository, you want to give a name that gives some insight to what the repository has. So you want to try to follow a convention. It shouldn't be anything crazy long, but you also don't want it to be like A. That doesn't tell me anything about your repository. You want it to have some information about it. In our situation, our project is scraping some data off of the EPA. So we'll call this one EPA Scraper Project. It's short, it's sweet, it tells me a little bit a kind of what the repository is. Now, if I want it to be more descriptive, I do have a description down here. So I could say, this is a Python project that collects and stores data from the EPA website. Just something like that. So that way, if people do look at your repository, it again gives some more information. And also when they search it up, they'll see this description. So again, you want to make it a little concise, but also meaningful. This is also the important part. So you can at this point specify public or private. Now, if for some reason, oh my God, I made it private and I want to make it public, or vice versa, you can change it after creating the repository, but I'll show you how to do that. It's just going into your settings. Now, everything here, these are optional, but you're going to include them. So a README file, this is basically like a Git starting guide with your project. You should always have a README file, especially for a project that's complex. A lot of people, they're going to clone your repository. You need to tell them how to use your repository, especially if you're planning to share it. Even for yourself, a lot of people, they assume they're going to always remember how their code works. I can tell you right now, if you do not visit your code after a couple months, you will forget how it works sometimes. So sometimes the README is really good about just clearing up some confusion points. A lot of times if I do have something like, hey, you got to make sure you have an account first, I'll put in like how to sign up for an account or something like that, just to make sure people have resources at their disposal. Git ignore. So in a situation where we're using Git, we know that Git tracks file changes. A Git ignore basically tells Git which files to ignore, right? So basically you're saying, don't track these files. Now, there's lots of templates out there and they're very language specific, programming language specific. In our situation, we're going to be writing our code in Python. So we're going to use the Python git ignore template. And basically what this is designed to do is it's designed to not track the files that nobody needs. So for example, a lot of times your Python code might be compiled behind the scene, or there might be all these like extra files that were generated when you ran your code. Those files do no good to the user and they don't need them in order to run your code. It's really just kind of your own local copy. And so that template you'll see has a bunch of those files marked for not tracking because it doesn't need to be tracked because a user doesn't need it in order to use your code. If you are planning to use your code open source, you can choose a license. So I've always done MIT license. It depends on your situation. You kind of have to just look into it. A lot of times people either do MIT or Apache. Most of mine are MIT. So it's basically just saying, hey, if you use this code, don't blame me if it doesn't work or something like that. You're basically just saying use it as is. And it's kind of your responsibility to, look at the code. And then from here, you have everything filled out so you can create a repository. Okay, so now that the repository has been created, we'll take some time and we'll explore this page and all that's on it. Some of these tabs are more important than other ones, and some of them you're going to be using a little bit more than other ones, obviously. So you see here that we now have a README file, we have a license file, and then we also have the git ignore file. So, all sorts of different kind of stuff. Really important. You can also see your little description. You can also see a new release, so you can actually do package releases, and then you can publish your first package as well. Some of this stuff is specific to certain languages. So Python, for example, I don't know if you can do a Python. Yeah, this is where you can't do Python. So for us, Python doesn't do us a lot of good here, but I like, if you're doing C# or something like that, it might be different. Okay, issues. So people might use your code and it might not work, or they might get confused, right? So this is where they're gonna post all their issues and say, hey, I tried using your code, it didn't work. This is great because a lot of times it works on your system with a lot of assumptions. You'll put it out to the world and then lo and behold, you'll have all sorts of people coming back and say, oh, doesn't work, or hey, this worked, but now it doesn't work. So this is just a nice, easy way for you to improve your code. People put on here, hey, like I tried running this file, it's not working, and you can kind of guide it through them. A lot of people here also do spend the time to kind of answer your questions. So I've seen that before where, other people might say, hey, like I'm getting kind of confused on how to do this. Like, how do I set up this code to make it operate the way I want it to? This is something, if you have the answer to it, don't hesitate to answer the question. A lot of people feel intimidated. They're like, oh no, I don't want to do it. It doesn't have to be the repository owner that necessarily answers the question. A lot of times it is community oriented. So it's kind of just like, hey, go out there and say, hey, I think you might need to change this about your code. It's not usually a big deal. I will say this, I've been on both sides now. I have issued my own issues, and then I've also had to fix issues. Probably the biggest thing is try to be as specific as possible. So if the code's not working, please tell the person where it's not working. Like, hey, I ran my code. This was what happened. This was the output. So you want to make sure you take the details of your system and to provide it in the issue. So you can do things like, hey, this is the operating system I'm on. Hey, this is the Python version I'm on. That way it gives people more detail, and then they can usually figure out what the issue is faster. A lot of times people say, hey, I ran the code and it didn't work. Okay, well, where didn't it work? What was the error it gave you? Did it always give you that error? Did it just all of a sudden happen? So again, try to be as detailed as possible. I've been on both sides now where I'm like, I'm kind of over detailed sometimes, but I've also had to sit there and like try to answer a question when person literally wrote like 5 words, right? So it's really important. You want to be as detailed as possible so that way people can help answer your question and ideally identify the issue. Now, some people are going to contribute to your code, or sometimes they say, hey, I found a bug and I want you to fix that bug. That's when we get in the concept of a pull request. So pull requests help you collaborate on your code with other people. As pull requests are created, they'll appear here in searchable and filterable list. To get started, you should create a pull request. So again, I have this on my repositories where people contribute and say, hey, Alex, I think you should add this functionality to your library. I say, great, open up a PR or a pull request, and I'll merge those changes if I think they're appropriate. Don't be offended if people don't merge your pull request right away. A lot of times it's usually because they've either incorporated the change or sometimes that specific enhancement is just out of scope for the project. So a lot of times people get very ambitious. They want to incorporate this and that, and then you're kind of getting into your own little beast, and really you're kind of going into a separate project. And so in that situation, again, don't be offended if somebody doesn't put it in there. A lot of times they're just cautious about making sure the code doesn't break, and that really, it's not going to make it more confusing for the user. Actions. So this is where you can set up workflows to do things like automatically test your code and then automatically publish it to things like PyPy, so the Python package index. I actually didn't realize that you could do PyPy. I just recently found that out, and I started using it, and I love it because I actually tried automating it on my local system, and I was able to do it, but it was just, I kind of was like, it'd be kind of nice if I could just automatically do it from GitHub. You can also access projects from here as well. So again, this is more for defining tasks that are going to be related to your repo and then automating workflows and all sorts of different things. It's just more for tracking and doing some really complex stuff. Wiki, this is kind of like documents stuff, and I don't know. I've seen it used differently. Like I've seen some people use it really for just documentation purposes, but then I've seen other people kind of go and say, hey, like this is just the roadmap for everything. Kind of depends. It just, people use it. I've actually never really used a wiki. I probably should because I've seen a couple repos who really effectively used it, and I thought it was great. So nice. I haven't used it though, so I can't speak too much on it. Security. So this is where it might give you security recommendations, policies, code scanning. This is actually kind of a neat feature that I don't know. Like, so they used to have this and then they kind of stopped doing it, I feel like. And now you have to have like an enterprise account to do it. So I don't know if this is still a thing, but basically it was supposed to like detect vulnerabilities in your code and things like, hey, like your access token is there where everyone can see it. You might want to make that private. So that was kind of the intent behind it. I don't know if it's still free. I feel like recently I read that you can use it, but you have to have like an enterprise plan. Insights. So this is where you can see the number of pull requests, open pull requests, closed issues, new issues, all sorts of fun stuff. Contributors. So the people who contribute to your code, not going to be used necessarily all the time. Community. So this is just about how you make it a better community page. You want to make sure you have a code of conduct, how to contribute, issue templates, pull request templates, lots of good stuff like that. Traffic, so how many people have cloned it or visited your repo. Commits, dependency graphs, all that kind of fun stuff. So this is like just the dependencies in your particular project. Network graph, never really use that. Forks, so if people fork it, you can also see it here. Dependency graph, we already talked about that. Okay, so that's kind of the main tabs. There's also some other ones up here. So these are people who are watching it. And basically it just means like as you make changes, they're going to get notified of it. These are people who star it. So this is one where, you know, if people follow it, they're going to be like, hey, you know, they'll just be notified of it. And then, you know, as you do releases and stuff like that, they'll be aware. Forking it, those people who copy it. And that's it in a nutshell. So what we're going to do next is we're going to clone our repository using VS Code. So first things first, I'm going to open up VS Code, Visual Studio Code. And this time I'm going to do a new window. New window. Come on. Jeez, we are slow. Why are we so slow today? Oh, I have to. Oh, it's because there was an update. That's why. All right, let me change the background color so it's a little bit easier to read. Abyss. Yeah, that looks all right. All right. So apparently they updated it, March 2021 update. From here, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to go back to GitHub. Oh, actually, one other thing here. So you can actually navigate in between the branches as well. So if you create a branch and you want to navigate and switch between it, you can also do that from GitHub as well. Right now, we're on what we call is the main branch. That is the default branch when you create a new repository. You can also see it here as well. Okay, so from here, let's say we want to clone it. See this little big green button? You would click this, and then you're going to see a couple options. The first one is cloning. The second option is opening this repository in an application called GitHub Desktop. So if you have that installed, you can actually open it from the web. And then you can also download a zip file, which contains all the files in this repository. Now we're focused on cloning. In cloning, you have three options. You can use HTTPS, you can use SSH, and you can use the GitHub CLI. The GitHub CLI is a new CLI that they released a few months ago. And basically it allows you to use a command line interface or CLI to do common GitHub operations, all from a terminal. Really nice. Haven't used it a lot, but I heard it's quite popular. In our situation, we're going to use HTTPS, and we basically want to copy this URL. So if you click this little clipboard icon, it will copy it to the clipboard. It doesn't give you like a little notification letting you know that it copied it, but it copied it. I'm going to close out this tab. And then from VS Code, I'll go to my source control pane, and then I'll see my option for clone repository. So I'll click that, and it says provide repository URL or pick a repository source. Now, a couple things. You could actually technically, yes, you can go. So if you have the GitHub extension installed, you can actually see all of your repositories here. So super nice as well. But in our situation, we already have the URL, so we'll just use that. You're going to press enter. The file dialog will pop up, and then you need to select where you want to put it. So I've already tested this video a couple of times, so we're going to do it again. Oh, not that one. Energy Scraper Project. Super simple. Okay, and then it would say, would you like to open the clone repository? Say yes, open it. All right, and then from here, you will now see the files that were on our GitHub repo. The gitignore file, the license file, and then the README file. So what we're gonna do next is I'm gonna cut off the video because I'm done talking about it. And then in our next video, we are gonna start the process of setting up our folder structure for our project. Once we've set up that folder structure, we will, what am I gonna do? We're gonna save the changes and we're gonna push them to GitHub. And then after we've done that, we'll start getting more into the actual writing of the code, and we'll talk about how we're gonna define our class object, how we're gonna set up our testing, and how we're gonna set up some other stuff to help us automate different things like that. However, at this point, if you do have any questions, feel free to put them down in the comments below. If I can help answer your questions about GitHub and all that kind of fun stuff, feel free to put them down. What else? But yeah, that's basically our next video. And then with that being said, we will see you in video number 5. See you soon.